I want to say a little bit about here, 19 Washington Square North. This center is designed to serve as a kind of gateway to NYU Abu Dhabi, a gateway from New York to Abu Dhabi. NYU Abu Dhabi is now in its second semester of its inaugural year, and I've had the privilege of being able to go over there about once a month. And it's really a wonderfully exciting venture. The programs here at 19 Washington Square North enable faculty, students, and the interested general public to participate in the Abu Dhabi project and to be part of the flow of ideas between the two campuses that we hope will ultimately be a hallmark of NYU Abu Dhabi. Since its opening in the fall of 2010, this center, 19 Washington Square North, has hosted lectures and panel events on basically a weekly basis devoted to topics that have become, and we hope will be, central to the partnership between New York University and Abu Dhabi. I'm going to let Rahma introduce today's speakers, Valentine Moghadam and Gayatri Gopinath, but I just wanted to say a few words about her first. Rahma Abdulkadir is a political scientist who received her doctorate from the University of Texas at Dallas. She's a specialist in gender and politics, African political studies, and political anthropology. She's got a number of current research projects that explore transitional justice in areas of failed statehood, as well as globalizing forces that have contributed to the well-being of women in Africa. She's also worked extensively on the shifts in Canadian policy for undocumented refugee women. She's currently a research fellow here in residence at 19 Washington Square North, and next year she'll be in Abu Dhabi, where she'll be teaching a course on gender and globalization. So, without further ado, Rahma Abdulkadir.
Good evening, everyone. I have the pleasure to introduce one of my idols and a great scholar, Professor Valentine Moghadam. Professor Moghadam is a professor of sociology and women's studies, affiliated faculty, political science department, affiliated faculty, English department, and the director of women's studies program at Purdue University. Between May 2004 and December 2006, she was the chief of the Section for Gender Equality and Development of Social and Human Sciences sector of UNESCO in Paris, France. Her work at UNESCO involved networking with and capacity building of women's organizations, as well as policy-oriented research on globalization and women's human rights, culture and gender equality, gender dynamics of conflict, peace, and reconstruction. Professor Moghadam helped establish the Palestinian Women's Research and Documentation Center in Ramallah in Palestinian Authority. Prior to that, Professor Moghadam was Director of Women's Studies and Professor of Sociology at Illinois State University. Professor Moghadam's areas of research include globalization, transnational feminist network, civil society and citizenship, women's employment in the Middle East and North Africa. She has lectured and published widely, as well as consulted with many international organizations on her research areas. She also prepared a background paper on Islam, culture, and women's rights in the Middle East for the UNDP Human Development Report 2004. She is the co-editor of Social Policy in the Middle East, Economic, Political, and Gender Dynamics. Professor Moghadam's many publications include several books, one of which is Modernizing Women, Gender, Social Change in the Middle East, which was first published in 1993 and then was published again in second edition in 2003. The third edition of that book is due out in 2013. One of her great books is Globalization and Social Movement, Islamism, Feminism, and the Global Justice Movement, which appeared in early 2009. She also published a book titled Globalization, Social Movement, Islamism, Feminism. She also published a really great work which is titled Globalizing Women, Transnational Feminism Networks, which won the American Political Science Association's Victoria Shuck Award for books on women and politics in 2005. Tonight, Professor Moghadam will be presenting, or her presentation tonight will focus on the relationship between advancement of democracy and the advancement of women with a comparative perspective on focus, with a comparative perspective as well as focus on the MENA region. Excuse me. Welcome, Professor Moghadam.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rahma, for the kind invitation and for the very generous introduction. I'd like to state, first of all, that I'm very happy to be here and to be back at NYU, actually, because I did spend a little time here earlier. When was it? Back in the late 80s, actually. My talk is entitled "The Gender of Democracy in the Middle East, Why It Matters." And just to give you a little bit of background, I first prepared this paper. Let me put this down. I first prepared this paper for a conference that actually took place in Cairo in December of 2005. And it was on democracy and rights in general and especially in the Middle East, or shall we say aspirations for democracy and rights in the Middle East and North Africa. Boutros Boutros-Ghali was one of the presiding figures there. And it was a big program, a big conference with lots of interesting speakers and such. And I was the one person who was invited to talk about women and democracy. So I prepared this, and I was trying to make a case for why it's important for everybody to take gender dynamics and gender issues very, very seriously when it comes to democracy, democratic transitions, and so on. Actually, it's very important to be thinking about gender dynamics in any context because of the integral nature of gender in social reality. But I also prepared the talk at that time for in another context, and that is the Council Council on Foreign Relations and such was having a debate about democracy in the Middle East. And one or two of their scholars and contributors were arguing that you have to separate out women's rights from the question of democracy and citizen rights in the Middle East. So I felt that it was time for me to really jump into that debate, and so I wrote a little piece for the Council on Foreign Relations and their bulletin, and of course I prepared the talk for the conference in Cairo. And since then, and especially more recently, given the developments in the Middle East and North Africa, what I'm calling democratic transitions in Egypt and Tunisia, and we don't know what's going on in some other parts of the region, and very tragically, I think Libya. I thought that it was an opportune moment to decide on that particular topic for tonight's presentation. So once again, Rahma, thank you very much for the invitation, and I'm really pleased to be here. Now, I want to just begin by talking about some what I think are some of the important developments or events of the past decade that form a kind of backdrop to what has been going on more recently, since December, January, February, and this month. And those are first the launching of the Arab Human Development Report. I'm sure many of you in this room are familiar with that report. And that was first launched in 2002, and there, of course, the authors, a group of social scientists and intellectuals entirely from the Arab region, identified these three major deficits. The women's empowerment deficit, the absence of democracy, and some deficits also in terms of knowledge generation and so on. So that's one. I'd also like to point out the Moroccan family law reform, which took place in 2003-2004, and this followed an 11-year feminist campaign. Now, in some of the simplistic versions of what happened in Morocco, it is said that, the king did it. Well, no, the king did not do it. This was the culmination of a long period of feminist campaigning, you see. The third very important one, of course, has to do with Iran, and the 1 million signatures campaign, which began in Iran and continues to this day, albeit under very, very difficult and repressive circumstances. In Egypt, between the periods 2006-2008, there was a series of worker protests and strikes and so on, including a very big one at Mahala El Kubra. And the youth movement that is called the April 6th Youth Movement, they get their name from that period and from the call for a general strike on April 6th, 2008. And last but not least, the Green protests of June 2009 in Iran, which were the first genuinely democratic mass protests in the region in this century. And there they challenged the results of a very rigged, election in Iran and so on. So I think these are very important to recognize as, an important backdrop to the events that have taken place more recently. Now, Oh, this is a little unwieldy. All right. So now let's move straight to these democracy movements that are ongoing and some of the causes and the issues. Those of us who have been studying the Middle East and writing about it for years have been writing also for many, many years about the problems. These authoritarian governments and, where there are elections, they are tightly monitored, controlled, and frequently rigged. So widening inequalities. The press has been talking a lot about that, but in fact we have known for a very long time that this is a problem in the region. And in fact the inequalities have been widening since the restructuring took place in the latter part of the 1980s and throughout the 1990s. So with the structural adjustment reforms and policies that were enacted, as well as some of these new trade policies and the bringing down of tariffs and the privatization and denationalization and so on and so forth, inequality has really been widening. And meanwhile, unemployment has also been increasing, particularly youth unemployment. If you go to cities like Cairo, for example, you will notice, and especially large parts of Cairo actually, you will notice this problem of deteriorating infrastructure. Of course, we see it in the United States too, but it has been a persistent problem in many of the countries, and especially these mega cities in the Middle East and parts of North Africa. So deteriorating infrastructure and public. When I was in Egypt in the early 90s, I remember taking a train from Cairo to Alexandria. And of course, I took the first-class train, but I noticed across the tracks, the third-class train. And it was so awful. It was just in such dreadful shape, with people hanging out and no windows and so on and so forth. At that time, I thought, the Egyptian people need to revolt against this. This is just really awful. In 1995, there was a big article by somebody named Cassandra, who also predicted that there would be mass revolt against all these injustices and so on and so forth. Well, it took 15 years, but the point is that for a long time, many of us who are specialists in the Middle East and so on and so forth have noticed these problems. So finally, they have come to fruition. Finally, people have said no more. Rising prices attenuated only by subsidies. This is another problem. And of course, the socio-demographics that many people, the press has been writing about, the so-called youth bulge, or what Americans were calling the baby boom generation. Well, guess what? The Middle Eastern baby boom generation is now in revolt too, just as the American baby boom generation was in the 60s and early 70s. So you have this very large population of very young people without great prospects. And a very high proportion of young people, male and female alike, are unemployed and without prospects. The role of social media technology has been commented on a great deal, and this large population of very young people are also networked. They may not all have PCs at home. But those of you who have been to the Middle East and North Africa have seen, internet cafes everywhere. And so that's also where, people will be gathering and finding out what's going on in the world and collecting with each other and so on and so forth. Last but not least, some of the issues that various accounts have been focusing on are the role of the military and the role of Islamists, and I might say a little bit more about that later on. So, what are some of the stated solutions to some of these problems then that I've just delineated? Well, it would be nice if we had a peaceful democratic transition. Obviously, people have been using the word revolution in connection with the protests in the Middle East. These are not revolutions. We can talk about that perhaps later on. But what I'm seeing is more of a Latin American style democratic transition, and I'll give you some examples later on too. Justice for those harmed by past policies and oppressive laws. Now that will be very important as well, obviously, and already there are calls for that in both Tunisia and Egypt. Constitutional reform, and of course we're seeing that going on in both Egypt and Tunisia. And of course economic reform, and with my little editorial comment over there, centered on the needs and rights of citizens. Recently the IMF produced a report that stated that that a major problem of the Middle East and North Africa is that there has not been enough economic reform. And of course, what they mean by economic reform is privatization and liberalization of prices and trade and so on and so forth. Don't believe them for a minute. There has been plenty of liberalization and economic reform of that type in the region, and the people don't like it. And so that's why they've been protesting, in fact. So we need economic reform that goes back to some of the ideals and aspirations and actually some of the policies of the past in the 50s and 60s that were motivated more by the social rights of citizens and so on and so forth, but perhaps repackaged in a more worker-friendly and certainly more woman-friendly way. Now, let me now raise some feminist questions, though, in addition to some of the issues that I've been raising. So all this talk about the Arab street, is the Arab street masculine? What kind of democratic governance can women's rights expect? What about women's equality, participation, and rights in both Tunisia and Egypt? And just to sort of give you a little bit of a hint here. I'm a little more positive and hopeful about Tunisia than I am about Egypt right now. And again, we can talk about that later on. But there are some very good reasons, and I'll refer to some of those reasons later on. Can we expect? Will women participate in the democratic transition and the building of new institutions? Well, one reason I'm more positive about Tunisia is that, in fact, the women's groups, representatives of the feminist organizations, are in fact already taking part in the deliberations and the discussions. In fact, on the 17th of March, there was a big seminar in Tunisia that was attended by the Prime Minister, by the former President of Chile, and I counted the number of speakers. There were 60 speakers there, and of those 60 speakers, 23 were women. So that's a pretty good proportion, and that's Tunisia. But a couple of the women's groups in Egypt have been complaining that women have not been invited to the table there. So it's a different scene in the two countries. Can we expect a male democracy or a democracy with a male face? These are terms that come out of Eastern Europe. When the first democratic reforms, in fact, resulted in a precipitous decline in women's political participation and their representation. And so East European feminists coined this term to describe the kind of democracy that had taken place in those countries. So what connection is there between patriarchy and authoritarian rule, between the advancement of women's rights and the advancement of democracy? And of course, I'll give you my thesis in a moment. And how can a democratic transition benefit working women and the poor? Oftentimes, democracy is assumed to benefit everyone, but it doesn't, you see. And there are different kinds of democracies, and I'll get to that in a moment too. But some of our most democratic countries in the world are also some of the most unequal, including the United States and, of course, South Africa. So we really need to be attentive to this. And actually, in countries of the Middle East and North Africa, the protesters are attentive to this. So I think that policymakers and scholars should also weigh in on these issues. And so for feminists, obviously, when we talk about women, women's rights, we're talking about women in different social categories, including poor women as well as, elite women. So let me now share with you my 4 propositions about the gender of democracy and about women in democracy. I argue that there's a strong relationship between women's participation and rights on the one hand and the building and institutionalization of democracy on the other. Where's the evidence? Well, Latin America, countries of Latin, in particular Argentina, Brazil, and Chile. Also South Africa, Southern Africa, South Africa as well as Rwanda, Burundi, Northern Ireland. In these countries, women's participation was a key element in the successful transitions. And these examples also show that outcomes could be favorable and advantageous to women, women's participation and rights, and that women's political participation actually propelled and helped and reinforced democracy. In other words, women's participation and rights in these countries were an important element of what political scientists call the democracy consolidation, the consolidation of democracy. However, there's a negative side to all of this too. Again, democracy is assumed by many commentators to serve everyone well, including women well, but the historical record actually shows that democratic transitions do not always bring about women's participation and rights or social justice, generally speaking. So we need to take, as far as women and gender justice is concerned, we need to take very seriously what is called the democracy paradox. This is a term that again came out of the experience of Eastern Europe. And I also use the term the gender-based democracy deficit, which means the marginalization of women from the political process in a democratic polity, or the dangers posed to gender equality when there is a kind of an opening, a quick, rapid opening of political space, and where fundamentalist or very conservative forces may take part. In the absence of very strong or a tradition of strong and legitimate institutions. Okay, and I'll make a reference to Algeria in a moment. My third proposition is that the long-standing exclusion of women from political processes and decision-making in the Middle East and North Africa is a key factor in explaining why the region has been a laggard. I think a lot of you in this room have probably heard of Huntington's third wave of democratization. A lot of the political science literature, especially in connection with the Middle East, has argued that first that the Muslim world has been a laggard, but actually it's not so much the Muslim world, but it's the Middle East, North Africa region that has been a laggard in this third wave of democratization. Well, the Middle East is now caught up, and not only that, I think they've taught the folks in Wisconsin a few things too, which is very interesting, and that might be spreading to Indiana and other places as well. But I would argue that there is a connection between this very, very low representation of women in the political process, and also, by the way, in the labor force in the Middle East and North Africa, and the existence of authoritarian states, and this sort of, slow or the absence of any kind of democratic transition. So, if countries then, like Tunisia and Egypt, are in fact making this democratic transition, then attention to women's participation and rights, including women's strong presence in the political parties. And again, there's evidence that this is happening in Tunisia more so than Egypt right now, but we have to wait and see, could speed up the transition in those countries and elsewhere in the region. So, that's another reason why the gender of democracy is important and women's participation is important. Okay, it changes the nature of the state, and it actually opens up political space and rights for everybody. My fourth proposition, and this is a very important one for me, and I think it is shared by many people in the region, that the mass social protests in December, January, February were as much a call for social justice as for civil and political rights. I'm not sure that the folks in the White House and World Bank and IMF quite accept that, but there it is. It is as much a call for social justice as it is, for economic citizenship and social rights as it is for civil and political rights. And so attention to social equality as well as gender equality will ensure a more stable and secure democracy in the region. Okay. I mentioned earlier that not all democracies bring about social justice or equality of citizens. And of course, Benjamin Barber wrote a very interesting book in which he focused on different kinds of democracies. And I've got this list of the different kinds of democracies, and their effects are also varying, especially in terms of social justice issues. But liberal democracy of the kind that we have in the United States, and also of the kind that tends to be touted around the world as the best form of democracy, of course there are very positive elements to it. For example, it calls for a very high degree of political legitimacy, for an independent judiciary, a constitution that sets out the relationship between state and society, and that also sets out citizen rights and obligations. This is very important. But feminist scholars and others too have pointed out that in a liberal democracy there tends to be this gap between formal rights and substantive rights, right? Between a formal democracy and real, democracy. And I think what is missing in that equation is the question of those material conditions that are needed for people to enjoy those constitutional rights and so on. And this is where social rights and economic citizenship becomes very, very important, you see. Which is the kind of issue that tends to be emphasized, let's say, in theories of social democracy or socialist democracy, etc. Again, when we are thinking, and when policymakers, our friends in the Middle East and North Africa are thinking about democratic models of democracy, I think it's very, very important to, for all of us, for them to bear in mind this difference between formal and substantive. And feminists have raised this in particular in connection with women's participation and rights in a democratic polity. But I think this pertains to citizens of different social classes as well. So what's been going on in the Middle East? Well, there, we've had, as I pointed out earlier, economic reforms, these of a neoliberal type, but very little political liberalization. Very little political liberalization until recently. And we've been seeing, some of these changes that are, forthcoming in Egypt and Tunisia in particular. Scholars have referred to countries in the Middle East as liberalized autocracies. That was a term that was used for Egypt at one point. Illiberal democracy, that really fits Iran very, very well, because there you have, these so-called regular elections. And they've been going on since the revolution took place, and yet they are tightly managed, they're tightly controlled, and also rigged. And so scholars have been calling for the core of democracy, getting citizens the ability to choose those who hold the main levers of political power, and creating checks and balances through which state institutions share power. This is Thomas Carruthers and Marina Ottaway. Marina Ottaway was a person who I admire her very much. She's an excellent scholar, but I think she's wrong on the question of separating out women's rights from citizen rights and democracies. But many of our scholars of the Middle East talk about democracy in this way, that democracy basically to them is defined as this sort of distribution of political power and political resources among different political parties through regular elections that shouldn't be rigged. Okay. Well, I'm going to question that definition because I think it's a minimalist definition. It's an important part of our understanding of democracy, but it doesn't necessarily serve women or working people and the poor very well. Okay, that definition only. So here are some of my feminist questions. Is the distribution of political resources or power through competitive elections an adequate or sufficient definition of democracy? What about citizen rights, participation, and inclusion? What about that, sort of bridging that gap between formal rights and substantive rights, you see? And then, of course, an issue that many feminist scholars, feminist political philosophers, political scientists have raised is the political subject or the rights-bearing citizen, male. And to hear a lot of scholars as well as commentators in connection with the Middle East talk about it, you would think that, yes, they are talking about mainly men. I would argue then that what we need to focus on is the quality of democracy and the institutionalization of equal rights. And this is really very, very important, and it's especially important to women. And I'll again expound on that in a minute when I talk about the experience in Algeria some years back. What's also important, of course, is the participation of different social groups in political parties, elections, parliaments, and decision-making bodies. And again, this question of social and gender equality. Okay. So, moving beyond this kind of minimalist definition of democracy to a much broader, more expansive understanding. So, for example, I have a quote here. Many states have constitutional provisions against discrimination on gender and other grounds, but to what extent are women's interests represented when political parties neither field women candidates nor make women's issues a fundamental, not fundamentalist, sorry, a fundamental part of their policies? Ooh, thank you. This is what we call a Freudian slip. Okay. A non-Freudian slip on my part. All right. And Mona Zulfiqar is an Egyptian feminist lawyer who was at that conference in Cairo in December 2005 when I first presented a simplified version of this presentation. And as she said, what use is the vote to a woman who is imprisoned in her home, who cannot initiate a divorce even if she is trapped in a miserable marriage? So again, these are feminists raising feminist questions about what does it mean? What does democracy, elections, the vote mean? What this minimalist definition of democracy does not necessarily suit poor women well, or women who are subject to the strictures of, let's say, Muslim family law, and so on and so forth. So democracy has to be a much wider, broader definition that includes equality in the family, within the household, in the community, at the workplace, at the national level as well. Okay. So, towards substantive rights and democratic reforms. So this is what we would be calling for. Political party quotas. Some of the countries have them, by the way, but with varying degrees of commitment to implementing the quotas, actually. So who does best? Tunisia tends to do best. Tunisia tends to do best on almost every indicator in the region. But not too many of the other countries. Again, equality and justice within the family. This is why the feminists call the Middle East, North African women's feminist call for reform of the family law is such a fundamental democratic demand. It is absolutely central and fundamental to the expansion, the broadening of not only women's rights, but also just citizen rights and democracy in the region. So you cannot separate out the two, you say. Also for the reason that Mona Zulfiqar gave, right? So security in the home and on the streets. This is, again, bridging this gap between formal rights and substantive rights. Freedom from sexual harassment in the workplace, paid maternity leaves, paternity leaves, child care centers, and social justice, as well as gender justice. So we have to understand democracy then as a multifaceted and ongoing process at different levels of social existence. I made mention earlier about positive and negative experiences with democratic transitions. I think that this kind of background and context is important because it helps us it helps us shape our thinking also about what might be possible for countries of the Middle East, North Africa in particular. In this case, I want to focus just on Egypt and Tunisia. In Latin America, again, in Argentina, Brazil, and Chile, women's movements and organizations were very much part of the struggle against authoritarianism and against the military dictatorships, et cetera, et cetera. And they also became, in some cases, they were part of the pacted negotiations. And in most cases, they were actually rewarded with political party quotas, with very large and well-resourced policy centers, with women and feminist women actually in important political posts and positions. In South Africa, Burundi, Rwanda, again, women were very much part of the liberation struggle in South Africa, peace building and so on in the other countries, and their roles came to be acknowledged and recognized. And again, with references in the Constitution, with political party quotas, and of course, you're probably aware of the fact that Rwanda currently has the highest female share of parliamentary seats in the world, having even exceeded Sweden. I mean, we have to wait and see if this continues, but it's been quite impressive so far. Northern Ireland is also another case, and it's a very, very interesting and important case, where women's organizations were really part of the liberation, independence, Republican movement for quite some time. We had the Northern Ireland Women's Rights Movement, which was founded in '75. We had the peace work of Maria Corrigan and Betty Williams, who also won Nobel Peace Prizes. The Belfast Women's Collective, the Northern Ireland Women's Aid Federation, and the Women's Coalition, which took part in the first elections. And at the end of those first elections, women's share was 14% in the first democratic election. So that was pretty good for Northern Ireland. Now, Eastern Europe, however, is more of a negative case. There, despite the massive participation of women in these sort of, democracy movements, if you want to call them that, what happened afterwards was this very drastic decline in their parliamentary representation, from an average of 30% to lows of like 4 or 5%. And what happened was that the quotas that had been such an essential feature of the communist era were removed. I mean, the new democratic governments and the officials wanted to be as different as possible from the previous. And so they, shall we say, threw out the baby with the bathwater. So by throwing out all of those quotas, you see, that I think, led, and also by not fielding women candidates, the new political parties did women a great disservice. And this is why East European feminists came up with this term, democratization with a male face. And then, of course, last but not least, is this question of democracy and social inequalities, which I keep coming back to because I think it's very, very important. So we're not separating out the question of women's rights and democracy, and I don't think we should separate out the question of social justice, economic citizenship, and also democracy, if by that we mean real and substantive democracies. So what makes the difference? I mean, what are the factors that shape this sort of patriarchal outcome for women in a democratic transition or a more egalitarian outcome? Well, I've listed a number of factors here, and these factors come from some of the work that I did earlier on revolutions and revolutionary outcomes. Myself and also people like Karen Kampworth and Julia Shane. And I've also referred to the work of Georgina Whalen, who has written a lot about Latin American democratic transitions in particular. So combining all of our explanatory frameworks, these are the main explanatory variables. These are the main factors or variables that explain whether an outcome of a revolutionary or democratic transition will be positive or negative for women. The nature of the transition and its ideology and so on. the extent of women's mobilizations, including the number and visibility of women's organizations and other institutions, and the role of women activists in the revolution or transition. The pre-existing gender relations and women's legal status and social positions, and the nature of the institutional legacy of that non-democratic regime. So here is where, for example, Tunisia has an advantage over Egypt. Both Tunisia and Egypt had very authoritarian governments, but the Tunisian state, and including the now deposed Tunisian president, always presented itself, or himself, as a champion of women's rights. And Tunisia had a number of well-established and well-resourced women's organizations and policy centers and institutes. Not really the case in Egypt. Mrs. Mubarak had one or two agencies and groups. She had something that I remember when she came to UNESCO, and she claimed that she was forming an international women's peace movement. And I was wondering, and I asked her chief of staff, so what's the institutional basis for this? And, there was none. So, this is why this question of this institutional legacy is important. There is that legacy in Tunisia, but there really isn't in Egypt. That's why I keep saying that I'm more hopeful about Tunisia. And of course, the new government's capacity and will to mobilize resources for rights-based development. Other feminist political scientists have pointed out that parliamentary systems, that party list proportional representation systems tend to serve women and also tend to serve party quotas, gender-based quotas better than majoritarian systems. And I think that in both Egypt and Tunisia we'll be seeing these types of parliamentary systems emerge. In addition, relationships to what sociologists and political scientists call world society, international organizations, and signing of international law, treaty ratifications, and so on and so forth, also tends to create a more congenial environment for women's participation in rights. So these are some of the factors that might explain, what direction women's rights might go in these kinds of transition periods. So what have we got then in the Middle East? Just to remind you of the legacy. Sorry, this is a table. I'm not sure how to make this completely available to you. But one of the reasons why women's political participation is quite low and has been consistently low in the Middle East and North Africa, apart from the usual, patriarchal reasons and so on, is also that they received the vote relatively recently, as you can see. So I think, we need to keep that, in mind too, and not always revert to sort of Orientalist assumptions or presumptions. But it is also true that that part of the world does have the lowest political participation of women, with, however, the variations. And again, Tunisia has consistently done well in that respect, consistently done well. UAE, went from 0 to 23% in the span of 1 year because, the head of the UAE decided that, but in Tunisia, it is more the steady process, the steady, consistent participation of women. Now, Iraq, of course, instituted a quota. I don't think that anybody would argue that, that women are really making a difference, or that quota has really made a difference for women's lives in the region. Unfortunately, it's an example of a kind of a artificial political quota. And of course, that's, Iraq is a different case, and it's a case of an imposition of a certain type of political model, and so on and so forth. And let's hope that that doesn't happen in Libya as well. Okay, so you can see that that Tunisia has generally had, well, at least since in 2008. Well, actually, since the early part of the 21st century, Tunisia has had political representation in the 20s, in the 20 percentiles. Okay. So we have a problem of low parliamentary participation. We also have this problem, and here I'm talking about this gender-based democracy deficit in the Middle East, the perils of democratization. So I'm arguing here that women can pay a high price when a democratic process that is institutionally weak or is not founded on principles of equality and the rights of all citizens or is not protected by strong institutions allows a political party bound by patriarchal norms to come to power and to immediately institute laws relegating women to second-class citizenship and controls over their mobility. This was the Algerian feminist nightmare. This is basically what happened in Algeria. And there you had a very rapid, quick transition. 1988, 89, 90, without the building, really fast from a model of Arab socialism to a model of liberal democracy, with competitive elections, etc. Without time for institutions that guaranteed citizen participation and rights to form, to gel, to be consolidated, and of course to the horror of the military and the ruling party, as well as feminist groups. The FIS, Front Islamique du Salut, a major Islamist organization, was the political party that actually came out on top of things. Now, then, some of you in this room will know what happened. The government annulled the elections, the results of the elections, in which the FIS, were slated to win, and then, of course, the FIS took up arms and launched a very, very violent and very ugly terrorist campaign and very violent civil conflict for the next decade, actually. Now, I defer to my Algerian feminist friends who say that, in fact, they were between a rock and a hard place. They had been very critical of the Parti Unique and of the Algerian state, but they were also alarmed and horrified at the prospect of the FIS, not out of some fantasy about what the FIS might do, but out of evidence of what the FIS had already done in districts and areas and neighborhoods under its control in the previous 2 years. You see. And so on the basis of that, they welcomed the crackdown. For that, they have been criticized by many, many political scientists, John Antilis and others who are experts on Algeria and such, and I have argued with them too, and I take the Algerian feminist position on this particular question. I should also point out that something similar to this happened in Turkey, where Erbakan, who recently died, a former prime minister in Turkey, he was also forced to resign, and his party was forced to dissolve itself. But in that case, they didn't take up arms. They did not resort to violence and terrorism. That political party regrouped under another name, and now is the ruling party, actually, of Turkey. So you see, different Islamist parties have different responses, and in Algeria, there was nothing, I think, nothing to justify what the FIS did, and especially the kind of sexual slavery and the ugliness that they were responsible for during the 90s. So that's the Algerian feminist nightmare. My good friend Yeşim Arat, a political scientist in Turkey, has written very favorably about the role of women's the new feminist movement in Turkey in the 1980s, which helped this transition from military rule to democracy. But more recently, she has argued that what we are seeing in Turkey today under the AKP, the ruling Islamic Party, is this democracy deficit. And she's arguing that with the expansion of democracy in Turkey, and especially under the aegis of the AKP, the Justice and Development Party, that there have been calls for more religiosity, the building of more religious schools, the diffusion of religious and conservative norms, including calls on women to value more, motherhood and so on and so forth. And so she's very, very nervous and worried about where this more recent democratization in Turkey is actually leading in terms of secularism as well as women's rights. Egypt, I think there's a serious gender-based democracy deficit there, and women's groups have already complained that they were left out of the deliberations on constitutional reform and so on and so forth. I mean, a lot of things have been going on behind closed doors there anyway, with remnants of this, that, and the other. And of course, you've heard that that there was a vote recently on the referendum, but not many people are happy about that. All right, I don't want to talk about this statement right now because it's a little. Now, what I do want to end up by arguing is that women's groups are the main agents and allies of democratization. Now, a lot of the political scientists, the pundits and commentators on the Middle East and North Africa, they tend to focus on the Islamist movements and the Islamist organizations as the ones that we should be focusing on and trying to, find out who the moderates are and work with them to, have a peaceful transition and so on. But they tend to ignore what are the genuine social bases and the genuine allies and agents of democratization, of real democratization. Real democratization. Not only this question of democracy means we'll pull down these authoritarian governments that we don't like, but then we might institute laws and norms that, are not necessarily to the advantage of women, young people, et cetera, with cultural restrictions and restrictions on women's participation and rights and so on. So it's the women's groups that are, I would argue, the genuine allies and agents of democratization. And there's a lot of literature on this too. I mean, you have to pull from here and there. There isn't actually, unfortunately, any sort of collected work on women and democracy in the Middle East. But again, what I mentioned earlier about Yeşim Arat's work and others on Turkey in the 1980s and the important role of women's groups there. Andrea Baron and others too have very important pieces about how central women's groups and feminist groups were in the early 90s in particular, actually throughout the 90s in the post-Oslo period. Tunisia, I've always been impressed by, a lot of the feminist organizations in that part of the world actually have the term démocrate or democrat in their title and in their names, you see. So, for example, in Tunisia, this Association Tunisienne des Femmes Démocrates, that is one of the most independent, autonomous, I think really impressive feminist groups, AFTURT as well. I remember talking to one of the Femmes Démocrates, she was actually a constitutional lawyer. That's another difference, by the way. You have all these judges and lawyers in Tunisia, but not you have lawyers in Egypt, but not these kinds of judges in Egypt. She said to me, she said, we know that our situation in Tunisia is better than in some other Arab countries, but she said, we are also working for democracy. We know that our government is authoritarian and we are working for democracy too. And it was very interesting in Tunisia at the time, as long as the women's groups were focused on what the government regarded as narrow women's rights issues, which, by the way, also included, let's say, jobs for women in the countryside, poor women, and that sort of thing. As long as they were focused on that, that was fine. But the moment any of the feminist groups, including women from Femmes Démocrates, would raise questions about human rights violations or broader citizen rights, they were arrested and prosecuted and jailed, and quite a number of them were. The Egyptian Center for Women's, Iran's 1 million signatures campaign, another clearly very democratic organization, Egyptian Center for Women's Rights, the Moroccan Campaign for Family Law Reform. So I think what is needed here, it's absolutely clear to me that the feminist groups in the region are absolutely the allies and actors, the main actors and agents of democratization. By the way, that's why I called my first book, it was my first book in the edition, Modernizing Women, Gender and Social, because I thought that women were at the center of modernization, but also democratization in the region. And so I continue to believe that very strongly. But what is needed for this smooth and stable transition are coalitions between feminist groups, trade unions, human rights organizations, and so on. And we're seeing this in Tunisia. That's why I'm positive. I'm more hopeful about Tunisia. So, engendering democracy, why it matters. Anne Phillips, political philosopher, had argued that women have interests and experiences and values and expertise that are different from those of men, due principally to their social positions. So this is one reason why they argue that women should be represented by women. So that's one argument. If this core of democracy is about regular redistribution of power through elections, then attention must be paid to the feminist argument that gender is itself a site and source of power that has always functioned to privilege men over women. If patriarchal and authoritarian regimes are to be supplanted by democratic governance, then women's participation is key to effecting such a transition. In other words, women's participation changes the nature of the authoritarian and neo-patriarchal state in the region. And of course, as I've been arguing, women are actors and participants in the making of a democratic politics, but also a democratic culture and a democratic society. Not just political democracy, but also a culture. Women may need democracy in order to flourish, but the converse is also true. That democracy needs women if it is to be inclusive, representative, and enduring. And women's participation and rights are good for democracy for a number of reasons. Women's issues address inequalities and injustices. Women's issues address inequalities and injustices, and the sustained presence of a critical mass. So you know that the UN defines a critical mass of at least 30%, right? Of a critical mass of women in political decision-making could help establish stable and peaceful societies. And I keep thinking about the Nordic countries, which, by the way, in every single data set, in every single study of gender and so on, they always come out on top. If in the Nordic countries, now this is just my sort of hope and my fantasy, and I think that there is some material basis to this. If in the Nordic countries you have such a high representation of women in politics, and you have had these consistently peaceful and genuinely democratic countries, then maybe having such a high representation of women in the Middle East could also end or help to end all these conflicts and the violence that we have become so accustomed to seeing. Thank you.
Not simply as this kind of top-down phenomenon, but one that has multiple effects. So she talks about a kind of globalization from above actually producing what she terms a kind of globalization from below. So this is where she situates the emergence of transnational feminist movements and other movements for social justice. So in that work, in that earlier work, Professor Moghadam sees both Islamist movements as well as neoliberal capitalism as effects of globalization. But she also sees these as producing these very vibrant transnational feminist responses. So I was wondering if Professor Moghadam could talk about how these sort of, the ways in which women's movements have emerged in these individual countries that you're talking about, how they constitute a kind of transnational feminist movement that is both regional and perhaps even diasporic. So that's one thing. But I think it's really important to keep in mind the ways in which globalization and neoliberal capitalism actually produces, as she says in her earlier work, these very powerful oppositional movements of collective action. The other thing that I also that I also find very useful in Professor Moghadam's work is the ways in which she talks about how transnational feminist movements have very clearly understood their demands as demands for economic justice, right? As demands for social and economic justice, rather than the kind of individuated ideas of what constitutes women's issues. And you were sort of referencing that today. And so what I think really emerges is how within these women's movements there's a kind of very sort of strong and powerful critique of neoliberal capitalism and these structural adjustment policies that also implicate the kind of consolidation of the private sphere as patriarchal. So what's so interesting is how these women's movements are refusing to separate these kind of larger issues of social justice and economic justice from what's happening in the so-called private sphere, which is, as we know, not private at all. Right? So finally, and this I think came out very clearly in your work today, I think what these transnational feminist movements are raising is the question of what constitutes democracy itself for women, and how perhaps these women's movements are actually redefining the notion of democracy itself outside of simply legal enfranchisement, which is so slight, right? So what constitutes rights, what constitutes participation and democracy itself, and perhaps these categories really need to be rethought through what these women's movements are giving us.
Yep.
So perhaps you may have a few thoughts, and then we'll open it up for discussion.
Yeah. Just very quick. Thank you, Gayatri. Those were really very nice, very thoughtful comments. And just very quickly, because I'd like to hear what you have to say as well in the audience. I have to say that a lot of my thinking about democracy, democratization, and this sort of redefinition of democracy that I've been working on, over these past few years, has, although of course I had been paying a lot of attention to Eastern Europe, I was so inspired by the Algerian feminists. I have to say that they really turned my mind around, because when Algerian feminist groups came and said, if this is democracy, I don't want it, that really got me thinking to how we need to redefine democracy in a way that is, friendly to women, to other disadvantaged groups, and so on. So yes, I think that's a tremendous contribution. I think that feminist, organizations and movements in the region have made, and this is one of them. Feminist, transnational feminist movements, of course, transnational feminist organizations have made tremendous contributions in terms of our understanding of the effects of neoliberalism. And by the way, this happened 10 years before the global justice movement was formed. In my book, Globalizing Women Transnational Feminist Networks, I documented, the emergence of these transnational feminist networks in sort of those early years of structural adjustment, so in the early 1980s. And so by 1984, 85, we see the emergence of, Women in Development Europe, Dawn, WIDO, and several others, and they had this critique of neoliberalism and this very sophisticated series of analyses of the effects on women, on the poor, on national economies, and so on. And this 10 years before the critique of neoliberalism actually emerged out of what later came to be called the global justice movement, Seattle and beyond. So I think that, again, feminist organizations, transnational feminist organizations, as well as national women's groups in various parts of the world have, I think, made tremendous contributions to the way we conceptualize, economic processes as well as political processes. Have global, events and so on made a difference in different parts of the Middle East? I would argue that, and I want to make a strong case for saying that in Morocco, for example, the family law reform was really not influenced a great deal by transnational processes and events. It really was homegrown. And although it was transnational in that you had this Maghreb collectif, of these women's groups across Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco, and they had been, collaborating and organizing with each other over a number of years. But I think we really have to give due credit to the women's groups, in those countries themselves for really coming up with the grievances, with coming up with a set of demands, with coming up with solutions, strategies, and so on and so forth. So it's a very interesting sort of issue, this interplay between, domestic and global, the national and the transnational. And I think we're still trying to figure out what that, connection is and what the different levels of transnational, processes are. But I think that the Moroccan women's groups in particular were very much sort of driven by national and domestic global processes, including, for example, the coming to power of a very progressive government in 1998, including, a very nice, communist minister in the cabinet, and several other, very nice cabinet ministers as well, like Aisha Bel-Arabi and so on. So, these are, conditions that, for example, we haven't had in Iran. So these kinds of, domestic
processes are very, very important and very determinate.
Great. So we have about 20 minutes for questions. So please, maybe at the back first.
I have a question in terms of the general definition of democracy. So I appreciate the perspective saying democracy is social, economic, cultural, and political rights, and not just abstract or bourgeois democracy. But aren't we really returning to the debates that began with the French Revolution over the notion of the rights-bearing individual? In 1790, the French National Assembly declared the right to subsistence, which today we call food security, a right of citizenship. The family law gave women the right to divorce and the right to inheritance, even though women didn't have the right to vote until 1944. But it seems like the whole history of democracy since the French Revolution has been one of contested definitions of for whom democracy should exist. And what you're illustrating is how this debate is now taking place in a new form and a new time. But are the questions new, or is it the conditions?
I think both. Yeah. Sure. I think both. For the Middle East, I think the questions are new, especially with respect to women's rights and democracy. As I said earlier on, there's been a tendency to ignore gender dynamics or ignore either the role of women in democratization or the impact of particular political, processes on women. There's been a tendency to ignore them, or if they're focusing on groups outside of the political elites, it would be Islamist groups. So I think that some of those questions are new, and of course the context is new too. This history of democracy, the French Revolution, of course, was historic. It was, an event of world historic, importance. And women had, very important gains initially, but not so much afterward. In the immediate post-revolutionary period, it wasn't so great. Women did lose out initially. So, this history of democratization is not a linear one, and I think we know that from our study of history and political processes and so on. And I think the outcomes actually were rather patriarchal for women in the French context. And I think that we've learned more from other revolutionary experiences too. Okay, so the French Revolution gave us, the droits de l'homme, but the Bolshevik Revolution also gave us, the rights of women. That was really the first time there was this, genuine and institutionalized reference and realization of the importance of women's participation
Participation and rights.
A couple of hands. First, here and then here.
Do you think that gender equality and democracy are achievable in religious states? And specifically, I would ask about two countries which are somewhat view themselves as enemies. Iran, which knocked off more than half of the candidates for not meeting religious tests, and then tortures, executes, and imprisons anyone who dares challenge the results of their elections. And Saudi Arabia, which counsels patience of women and is busy sending troops into another Middle Eastern country.
The short answer is no. So in my country of birth, Iran, we have a very problematic situation, it's no accident that we've had the emergence of these feminist organizations, and especially the campaign. Two of the most prominent campaigns were the 1 million signature campaign, as well as the End Stoning Forever campaign. So no, we cannot have women's rights and participation in a theocratic or in any kind of society that is governed by religious law. I'm sorry, any society that is governed by religious law. Obviously, Saudi Arabia actually is even more problematical than Iran in many respects, because at least in Iran, the kind of gender segregation, seclusion, and restrictions on women that exist in Saudi Arabia don't actually exist in Iran. So there's more mobility and so on in Iran compared to Saudi Arabia. But I would extend that to Israel as well. Israel, because of the religious-based family law, you see. So although the other institutions in Israel tend to be democratic, well, I guess more democratic for the Jewish citizens than for the non-Jewish citizens. But even so, the Jewish women citizens, I think, suffer under the halakha law, that is the law of the land. So yeah, the answer is basically no. You cannot have women's rights in any kind of legal or political system that is governed by religious law. And I believe that very strongly.
There's a lot of questions. Yeah. Should we have people
Maybe, yeah. Okay, and I'll try to take some notes.
Let's do a bunch of questions at the same time. First.
I recently read an article that made a distinction between Islamic feminism and secular feminism as two movements that are occurring in parallel in the Middle East. And obviously, in some cases they're occurring in the same country, in other cases they're occurring in separate countries. So I was wondering where you think the Islamic feminist movement, what the role of the Islamic feminist movement could possibly be in this, particularly since you're arguing that there's a need for real institutionalization of the role of women, and one could argue that institutionalization could also happen within the context of Islam. So if you could comment on that.
Sure. Was there a hand over here?
Yeah. So you briefly referenced this in your comments, the referendum that just happened in Egypt and the yes vote to move forward with the constitutional amendments, likelihood that there will be parliamentary elections in the short term. And many commentators have indicated that that is going to be a positive for groups that have been entrenched, like Muslim Brotherhood, and therefore have commented that there will be a negative impact on on women's rights as a result. I'd like to hear your views and also thoughts on what could be done to ensure that there is not a further undermining of women's rights in this democratization process.
In Egypt.
In Egypt.
I know this wasn't necessarily part of your presentation, but do you have any thoughts on Libya and what seemed to be, I mean, you know, the video footage and things? I don't see or, you know, in print reporting, hear as many voices from female people on the street. And is that, you know, my guess, well, I've heard some people say the women are staying at home because it's just really dangerous to be on the streets. But, you know, then what does that mean going forward if he's deposed?
In the more theoretical plane, if we look at something like J.M. Tickner's binary oppositions theory, in your view of redefining democracy, do you see more of an ungendering of the discourse that she talks about, where we want to have things not be women and men separately, but just value everything equal? Or is it that women have something distinct to say, and that needs to maintain separate in that way, but entered into the discourse?
Okay, that's a lot. 7 minutes to do it. Is there any other thoughts on that? Cynthia, did you have
Well, all right, I'll ask. I am interested in the role of religion. It seems to me that every country you point to, Eastern Europe, what happened is that the Catholic Church became so dominant, which then removed women's reproductive rights away. And we see it in our own country as well, on the part of the Tea Party people, or at least some subset of them. So I'm just wondering that, and I heard right before I came here that there's a lot of concern about the mobilization tactics of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt now, with regard to them insisting that there be an immediate ratification of the constitution as set out, which does not include women's rights in it, and in fact has a distinct prejudice for a male head of state. So the question to me is that how can we have democratic institutions with the strength of these religious bodies within these societies? I mean, I hope that we manage it here in the United States. But in these other countries that really have a very strong democratic orientation, the question is structurally.
Yeah. Thank you all. These questions and comments are excellent, and they give me some additional food for thought as I continue to work on this question. Let me just begin first by saying about Libya that I really do need to state my unequivocal opposition to the assault on Libya. I think it's important for me to say that. I think we're seeing Iraq all over again, and it's, in my view, it is very, very wrong. And other than that, the situation's rather confused. Bombardments are not, a context that is most conducive to, sort of rational decision making and understanding and such. And I think that it will only complicate and worsen the situation in the country, as I believe it did in Iraq. The question about your question about Ann Tickner, I love Ann Tickner's work. I think it's just terrific. But you see, where groups of people have been marginalized, there has to be some redress. There absolutely has to be some redress. And you have to have policies and mechanisms in place to, let's use this very standard term, level the playing field. Okay. Now, that is what affirmative action was about in the United States. It was very important and absolutely necessary, as a form of redress to, in other words, to say that African Americans had been had received this huge injustice over, centuries, and therefore we have to institute policies to ensure their participation and their rights. Right? So, and some advantage in the labor market, let's say. That's the sort of thing that is needed for women right now in places where they have been historically marginalized. So no, I don't think that we can talk generally about citizen rights in the Middle East and North Africa, because women have been marginalized and excluded systematically for so long. We have to talk about women. Absolutely have to talk about women. So if you call that a binary, then I'm afraid we have to maintain it. And I want to go back to that other Gayatri Spivak's notion of, this sort of, you have to sometimes take the risk of essentialism and, use this sort of essentialism strategically. And I think we need that in the region, both to address and redress a historic injustice to women, but also to accomplish what I've been arguing all this time, is to actually move forward the whole democratization process. I mean, how can you have democracy when such a huge part of a population is excluded from it? Is excluded from rights, is excluded from representation, is excluded from the institutions, whether these be labor markets or political institutions. So we've got to talk about women. So thank you for that. Islamic and secular feminism. I've written very positively about Islamic feminism, but first I want to make a distinction between what we call Islamic feminism and Islamist women. These are very different phenomena. So Islamist women, by definition, are not feminists. They cannot be. What they are, when they form themselves in these ladies' groups, they are auxiliaries of the rule, the Islamic party, the Islamist party. They are not questioning gender hierarchies. They are not questioning the gender relations that exist, these unequal gender relations that exist in the countries. That's not what they're about. They're about appealing to other women to help move forward, not women's rights, not the advancement of women, but the advancement of the Islamic party and Islamic laws and norms. That's different from the project of Islamic feminists. Islamic feminists are believing women. They are genuinely believing Muslim women who strongly believe that their religion has been hijacked, totally misinterpreted and distorted over the centuries by various male jurists and today by politicians and patriarchal imams and so on and so forth. And so because they are believing women, they want to recuperate their religion for themselves, and for their citizens and their society. And they want to show that there is an egalitarian, emancipatory core to Islam. Now, then the question becomes, okay, there are several questions in that connection. Can the Islamic feminists and the secular feminists work together? Okay, and in some cases they do. They were working, sorry?
Yeah, and Kuwait and Bahrain seemed like the alliances were fruitful.
Yes. Yes, there they were, certainly in Kuwait and Bahrain. There was a lot of cooperation in Iran. But Iran, which more or less became famous for Islamic feminism, actually Islamic feminism has been on the wane in Iran. And the feminist discourse in Iran today is almost exclusively secular and drawing from international women's rights agenda and laws and norms. That discourse that we were writing about in the 90s and such, that is more or less gone. But in other places, it remains, it's important, it's a very important it's a very important project, and it's a legitimate project. But again, we need to distinguish Islamic feminism from Islamist women. Of course, the other question that, which I should also say, is that is it a project that that can succeed? One reason, or are there limits to the discourse, to the project, to the strategy? And I think one reason why it sort of dissipated in the Islamic Republic of Iran, but this may simply be because of the nature of the Islamic Republic as an Islamic Republic. Basically, the leaders said to these Islamic feminists, shut up. You know, we know Islam better than you do. And your argument is not going to make any difference. And it's not going to get us to change our laws and our norms just because you say that you have a better interpretation of Islam. So, you know, as a strategy also, as a political strategy, also, it didn't work in Iran. So whether, you know, but I'm saying that that is the context of Iran. It may have a more enduring and fruitful prospect elsewhere.